We good? Yes, fantastic. That's good. Good morning again. Thanks for the opportunity to be able to share with you this morning on the Sermon on the Mount, which is really good. So firstly, congratulations on the 100 years. I don't think has anybody in the room been here the whole 100? No? I don't know, but it's really an inspiration. So our church back in Perth, we're a church plant, and we started in 2019, just 9 months before COVID. So that was well planned, and so we're 6 years in, and we're just about to move into our own facility, a rented facility. We've been bumping in, bumping out for 6 years in other facilities, and so really excited. Next week we start into our own building. And we were talking in the church just about vision for the next year and such. And I was able to use this church as an example of how to think bigger. You know, people are thinking, what are we going to do in the next couple of months, next couple of years? We're a very young church. It's 18 to 25-year-olds. And I said, look, the church I went to when I lived over east has just been celebrating 100 years. And so we're thinking about the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months, what we're going to do. But what about 100 years from now? What are we sowing in now that's going to impact generations of people that are not yet born? And what it's actually done is it's helped the whole leadership team of our church to look bigger. And I've noticed they've started talking generationally since I started using you guys as an example. So thanks for being a good example. And it's impacting other churches as well, at least one. I'm sure others, but at least it's impacting our church to think in a bigger sort of way. We've had about 11-year journey with this church, our family. We went here when we started living here in 2014, and this church as well has been supporting us in our mission for the last about 8 years, I counted. And so we're very, very grateful for that. And for the many of you who comment and pray for us and keep going on our journey, we're very, very grateful to have people that are connected with what we're doing and committed to that as well. It's really good. Well, we're going to be finishing up the sermon series that you've been going through since June on the Sermon on the Mount. I've been sort of following along with you on the videos on YouTube, and it's such a great sermon series to be able to go through, and it's a great privilege to be able to bring this to a close. And so you've been looking at this photo. Does this look familiar to everybody? And then I should also mention Aldi. It's good, different, right? Yes? Okay, good. That's still the thing. All right, fantastic. So I'm sure you have the entire Sermon on the Mount totally memorized by now. Right. But remember the thing on the left is the Beatitudes. What is the good life? How Jesus starts talking about that. And then in the main section of the sermon, there's the three parts. And in that blue sort of section, Jesus talks about what does it mean to do the right thing by others. And he gave 6 case sort of studies in that. You've heard it said, but I say to you, that kind of thing. In the second section, the purplish section, is about doing right by God and sort of not doing our giving or our prayer or our fasting to be seen by others, but to be seen by God. And then in the third section is kind of putting both of those together, doing right by God and right by others. And so today we're going to do that very last section, chapter 7, 13 to 27, which is the sort of closing challenge that Jesus gives, the choice that he offers people in this sort of section of this block of teaching. This is the first of 5 major sets of teaching in the book of Matthew. And here Jesus is bringing it to a close and bringing a challenge. And so we're going to listen to that challenge today. And so in this series, it's been a challenging view of life, isn't it, that Jesus is presenting. He's presenting different ideas of what it means to live in the right way, that are flipped on its head, that challenge our default assumptions of what it means to live in a right way. That it's not just about our actions, but it's much more difficult. It's about what goes on in our heart. And so at the end of this sermon, the challenge is, will his listeners respond? And of course, then, will we respond is the broader questions. And there's 3 parts to this last section as well. You've probably noticed that this sermon is broken up in sets of 3s very purposely because it's helpful for us to remember. And here there's sort of 3 illustrations. There's 2 gates, there's 2 trees, and 2 types of foundations. These are some of the most familiar illustrations that we get from Jesus. And so you probably know them well if you've had anything to do with church. But that's the point where we've got to pay special attention, because you know what this is about, right? And that's where we're in danger is when we know, oh, I know this one. Yeah. So we want to just take a step back and say, okay, we know it, but do we know it? And are we living it? So I'm going to read to you bit by bit of this. I didn't get all the scriptures on my slides somehow, so that is my problem. I don't know what I did wrong. Probably just copy, paste, delete something. Anyway, but we're going to start at chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. It may come up on the screen, but it's definitely here in front of me. Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." All right, do you want to put that picture of a gate up just to inspire us? Thank you. There's a gate or a door or something like that. So Jesus has been contrasting the difference between outward religion and inner heart transformation, yeah? And so in this context, the two gates that he's putting up is about the choice between those two types of life. I know I often heard it used as an example of our eternal destiny. Which direction will you choose? And sort of in a broader way, it can be about that. But in this context, it's much more closely related with which set of life skills are you going to take up? Are you going to be concerned with your outward behavior, or are you going to go for the inner heart transformation? And so the narrow gate and the narrow way is about the way of the heart, in which God challenges us. And the wide way is where it's only looks good on the outside. And so the question that we have to ask is, how constricted does our life feel in following Jesus? That's a funny thing, because in another place coming up, he'll say that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And that's also true, but there's also this aspect of following Jesus where it brings constriction upon us, where it does feel narrow at places. And of course, we know that leads to life, and that leads to a wonderful new expression of joy and freedom. But there is real constriction that comes into our life in following Jesus. And so my question for us is, do you feel that in any decisions that you have to make in life? Or do we make the same sort of decisions that everybody else makes, and we kind of fit in with what's going on in our society? Because a life that follows Jesus should hurt sometimes. I mean, life in general has pain. You can't avoid that, of course. But life that follows Jesus sometimes requires of us sacrifices that we wouldn't have made if we weren't following Jesus. And we can kind of get comfortable with following Jesus. But this sermon challenges us not to get comfortable with that, but to actually take that narrow path and take those difficult decisions, both as a way of life and then in individual instances as well. So this is starting off comfortable, isn't it? Let's keep moving on to the illustration of two trees from verse 15. Jesus says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Thank you for giving me the really encouraging ones. So this passage is talking about false prophets as wolves and as bad trees, and then there's also this picture of the judgment day. So this middle section is also divided in three, because everything divides into three in this. And so there's two metaphors and then a future scenario here. And what it's framed as is, how do we recognize false prophets? And it's by their fruit. And you can put up my inspirational picture of bad and good fruit. Thank you that I took that picture from the internet. It's very good, isn't it? So this originally is talking about like false prophets. Now, prophets here is a problematic word because we often think of those that predict the future when we think about how we use the word prophecy. Think more about messengers, those that come claiming to speak from God. And there's a lot of people that claim to speak for God, right? You find them all over the place. But how do you know if they're actually messengers from God? And Jesus says, look at the fruit of their life. Look at what they are producing. And so Jesus has already talked a lot about doing right things for the wrong reasons. But this is now a warning for how we look at what is happening in other people. And of course, it's not just a warning for looking at those that you follow. It also turns in on ourselves. What kind of fruit are we producing? Wolves dressed as sheep is a very funny image, but it can become so familiar to us because we hear it. Wolves in sheep's clothing has become sort of an English sort of idiom. But imagine hearing that for the first time from Jesus. Jesus in his preaching is often very clever and very funny. And I love this image of a wolf dressed up as a sheep coming to him. Now, Simon suggested I do something here with this sermon, which I thought was a good idea, so I will, is talk about some various translation issues that come up in passages like this. And there's several within this passage that you spend a lot of time trying to work through, you can imagine. Sheep and wolves are not known all over the world. Yeah, there's no wolves up in the Kimberley, for instance, right? And in many parts of the world, this imagery doesn't really work. So what do you do in different translations? Well, there's a few different options that people take. You could substitute another sort of ferocious animal and then a meek animal pair. So, for instance, in some translations, like in the Navajo in the southwest of the U.S., they used a coyote instead of a wolf. Or in the Lingala language that's spoken in Congo, among other places, they used a leopard instead of a wolf. That's one way that you can go about it. Also, you could just use a general term, saying a fierce animal, and let the people sort of figure out what's going on there. Another option is to just get rid of the metaphor altogether. So there's a language in Mexico that did that, where they translated, well, this is back in English from what they translated in their language. Beware of the lying teachers who will arrive to where you are, saying that they speak God's word. Don't let them deceive you, because on the outside it appears that they are good men, but concerning how they live, they spoil everything wherever they go. So there's different ways that you can deal with some of these metaphors, and the translators that I've worked with make different decisions about it. Obviously, the main issue going on here is people are not always what they appear to be, which I think we're all very familiar with that idea, both from people that we know and from ourselves, isn't it true? So how do we know? This is where Jesus gives us the example of two trees. If it looks good on the outside, how do you know if it is good on the outside? This calls for discernment, especially today where anybody with a microphone and some podcast equipment can put out whatever they want to do and say whatever they want to say. And there's so many hot takes going on with people that sound like they're experts, because all you got to do is wear some glasses and sound like you know what you're talking about, and people will believe you. It's a wonderful thing. And so Jesus says that's not a 21st century problem. That's been a problem all the way through, that we need to be discerning in what's going on. And so we look for the fruit of people's lives. Now, in one way, that means we have to be judgmental. And we're not supposed to judge, but then we're also supposed to judge, which is one of those lovely paradoxes of Jesus. So here's one of the times when we're allowed to judge. And if you're anything like me, you're probably very good at judging people. I do it almost without thinking. So here we're called to do that. Now, what's really funny is this image of a good tree produces good fruit and a bad tree produces bad fruit, you would think would be very easy to translate. But I remember a few months ago, I was up in Western Thailand, and we were dealing with the parallel passage in Luke, which uses the same analogy. And it was so difficult to translate because everything is so luscious and beautiful there. They said a bad tree just doesn't produce fruit. Like, there's no bad fruit. Good trees produce good fruit. Bad trees just don't have fruit because apparently they just don't have that problem at all. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to deal with what I thought was a very similar, simple sort of metaphor. Another thing that goes on that we often have to deal with is this question, rhetorical questions. When Jesus says, do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? This is a rhetorical question that's Obviously they don't do that. And in many, many languages, they don't have rhetorical questions. That's a feature in some languages and not others. So sometimes you just have to put it into a simple sentence. People don't do this. That one's pretty easy to sort of deal with. The next part of this passage says, it's the context of Judgment Day, where people say, Lord, Lord, didn't we do all of these wonderful things for you? And then Jesus says to them, I never knew you. This is a frightening verse, actually. This should make us feel very, very sober. And in this context, what does it mean to know Christ? It's not about the outward actions. It's not about doing things, actually. It's about that inner heart transformations. And this is one of those passages where we're not judged based on our actions. There are other passages where Jesus tells us that you will be judged based on your actions. Here he says that's not it, though. It's not just about the ministry that you do or that you look like a Christian. It's what's going on the inside as well. And so at first, this feels like a warning to watch out for other people. But we know that Jesus is very clever, so he's not just saying, watch out for those bad people, but he'll always bring it back to say, watch out for yourself. So the question we have to ask ourselves, is there a little wolf hiding inside you, oh sheep? And probably there is. What kind of fruit am I producing? And you know what? This is especially hard for Christians. And really, really hard for those of us that are in ministry, because we do Christian things all the time. For those that hang out in church, it's really, really easy for us to become religious and hypocritical. It's almost the default position that you go into by just showing up for church, isn't it? It's easy just to have the form of Christianity. And of course, Jesus challenges us to look at what our life is producing. Do we have good fruit or bad fruit? And it might be nice to just sort of let ourselves off the hook and say, oh, I'm fine. But you know what? Jesus would challenge us to be more sensitive to what's going on. Is there any type of bad fruit that I see happening in my life? Am I like a little ravenous wolf that's going around? Am I saying things that I'm not doing? And of course, we don't want to be like that, but we are all like that at some times. And so Jesus is offering us that choice to say, don't just look at what other people are doing, but look at your own self as well. I don't think I have the end of this passage because somehow I didn't copy it in, but I'll read it to you. It finishes off, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now you can put up my inspirational picture of bad building techniques. And so the picture that Jesus is painting in context there would be those Middle Eastern wadis that are dry most of the year, but every so often there's rain that comes rushing through. I don't know if you've ever seen videos of that. We have them as well up in the north too, where you get, you cross over rivers. It says such and such river, and you look down and it's completely dry. There's nothing there at all, but every so often the waters come and flood. And so the riverbed could look like a really good spot for building, because that's, especially if you're in a wilderness country like Israel or like out some of the places that I work up north, there's not a lot of good land for trees or for water. And so the riverbed could look like a good spot because there's shade, there's water and that, but it's actually a bad spot because every so often the floods are going to come and wash everything out. And so the rocky high ground might seem like a worse place to build because there you have the wind and the hard ground to get into, but it actually is the best place to be when the water rises up. So that's a very good sort of illustration, except it doesn't work in some places, that illustration, because of different types of soil. For instance, the Asmat language in West Papua up in Indonesia, they live in a very swampy area where there's no stones, there's no rocks. And so they have to change how they translate it. So they translated it like this, if you put it back in English: the wise builder is like the person who builds a house on stilts made of iron wood, which lasts a long time. While the foolish builder is one who builds a house on stilts made of white wood, which will rot quickly. And so sometimes you just have to say, oh, it's like a house built really well versus one that's not, or one that's built on a rock to make it very, very strong. And you know what? This illustration is just like the last two illustrations. It's sort of saying the same thing. Be careful of doing the thing that looks right to everyone. It might seem like building down in the riverbed is the right thing to do, but it's not actually very good. This story reminds me of where I grew up. I grew up in the States, in an area that was very prone to flooding because it's very, very flat land, like as flat as a tabletop. And so every spring in the snow melt, there would be floods for years and years and years. And people would build their houses right on the river. And then every year they would desperately call for people to help sandbagging every single year. And so one year, finally, the city said, that's the last of that. We're buying up all of those houses and we're building up a little hill. And lo and behold, they haven't had problems with flooding since. It just only took decades and decades to actually, well, the water still comes every year. Like it's still snow melt and the river still rises, but now they're prepared for it and nobody's houses get damaged. Well, there is one guy who wouldn't sell his house, of course. So he's still got to deal with it, but it was there last time I saw it. And so the picture here is, where are we building our lives? Because like Proverbs says, there's a way that seems right, but in the end it leads to death. And so we live in a society that has a lot of wisdom for us and how we're supposed to build our lives. And so those of you that are younger that are making the decisions and how are you going to build your life, there's a lot of wisdom that we're given. Not all of it is good. Because if you build your life according to the wisdom of our society, you will get the results that our society gets. We prioritize a lot of things for financial security that are not necessarily bad, but may not lead you to the ways of God. And so sometimes we have to make decisions that are contrary to perhaps what we might think. At the end of this chapter, I didn't put this scripture up either, I apologize. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. Notice the people's response to Jesus. They're amazed because of his authority. Some translations in other countries, like in West Papua, they stood with their mouths open, is the way they talk about being amazed. Or they shook. It's one language from Burkina Faso. My favorite, though, there's the language Uduk in Ethiopia. They shivered in their liver. That's how you say. That does it. You know, that's the idiom for being amazed or being a little bit frightened because, wow, who is this? So do you shiver in your liver at the teaching of Jesus? You know, these teachings are so familiar. You don't have to be around church for very long until you've heard these illustrations of the narrow and the wide gate, of the good tree, of the two foundations. And so the danger of hearing them over and over, and of course we should talk about them over and over, is we become over familiar and they lose their impact upon us. But really in these teachings, there is a choice that we need to consider. So are we feeling constricted in any way in following Jesus? We should, you know, that in a way we should feel constricted. There should be some limits that we voluntarily take on our life because we're following Jesus. Decisions we make that are contrary to what perhaps other people would do. I mean, I remember our senior pastors at a church, when they were getting ready to start the church, they invested their house deposit to start our church. I mean, what a stupid thing to do, right? And in this economy, and yet it was the perfect thing to do, to be able to invest that. That's a completely insane thing to do. But the fruit that we've seen out of that is because of the great sacrifice they've done. Sometimes Jesus calls us to do big and little things that seem a little bit crazy. What fruit do you see out of your life? Are you seeing good stuff or bad stuff? It always will reflect what's going on in the inside. You know, one of my least favorite sayings is, you are who you really are at your worst. I hate that. There's something to that, though, that what comes out of us at our worst often is an indication of what's still on the inside. And are we building our life just like everybody else? You know, if people look at your life, could they tell that you're a Christian? Is there anything about you that gives that away? Or are you really secretive about it? You know, is your life pattern exactly the same? These are big questions, aren't they? Especially for a Sunday morning. And thank you for giving the guest preacher these hard questions to ask you. But I've been really challenged as I've looked at the Sermon on the Mount. I've been listening through the Bible Project podcast. They have a huge series where they've talked through it. Last year, they talked through it for almost the entire year. And it was so refreshing and challenging to go through that teaching that I thought I knew really, really well, heard many times. But many parts of it, I'm not applying into my life. It hasn't impacted me in the way that it should. And I hope that over the last couple of months, as you guys have been looking at the Sermon on the Mount, you felt that sort of challenge as well. And so as we come to the close of this today, I want to just sort of invite reflection. You can have the music team come back up to finish us in song. But having heard these challenges through these simple and familiar metaphors, one of the options we have is to say, that's fantastic. I'll just leave that to the side. I don't want to be challenged by that. I think the other option that Jesus would have for us is to look a little bit deeply. Is there more outer form of Christianity going on for me, or is there more inner? Is there any area of my heart that needs to be transformed this week? Anything that I'm noticing that Jesus might just be pointing and saying, there, that's the one you need to look at. And so as we close, I'll just pray for us. And at the end of the service, we'll be up. The few of us will be up here, just if you want to talk or pray about any of those things. But we'll be going into another song now. Jesus, thank you so much for your powerful teaching. That still, after centuries, we can meditate and pour over week after week after week, and still be deeply challenged. Thank you for these challenges that you gave that original audience so many years ago, but still can impact us today. Lord, I pray that you would point to our lives and to our hearts things that we need to change, the narrow gate we need to walk through, that we might actually know you in that last day, not just with the outer form of being a Christian, but actually with that inner heart transformation. We thank you for your word and thank you for speaking to us today. Amen.